The Keystone XL is a very high pressure pipeline. Something people need to understand. This is 1440 psi or 1600 psi. A car tire, by way of comparison, is usually about 30 psi. So this is much more in the realm of what a high pressure gas tank or a scuba tank would be. You know, the oil coming out, the pressure coming out of a pressure washer might be in the range of the Keystone XL pipeline. That's what the pressure it's under. And it's also high temperature. It's permitted to operate up to 158 degrees. That's certainly well into the scalding range for humans if it gets on you. Probably it will operate more like in the 120 to 130 degree range, but that's still hot enough to burn people. You know, so this is not like it's flowing through the ground as this gentle flow of oil, you know, underground. This is if it ruptures, it'll blast, you know, oil hundreds of feet in all directions, depending on how it blasts. It'll be like a geyser of oil, and anybody near it will be really be in harm's way. And that's something that, as we think about this, a lot of the pipeline regulations were drafted back in the 90s or back in the 80s, or written back in the 80s, and they were for smaller pipelines under lower pressure. Well, we've got much bigger pipelines than in the past under much higher pressure. And if you remember your high school geometry, the capacity of a pipeline of a circle, the capacity of a circle increases by the square of its diameter, pi r squared. Remember that? So, you know, a 36-inch pipeline has a lot more oil in it than, say, a 24-inch pipeline. Because of that, it increases by the square of the diameter. So these bigger pipelines are much bigger and much higher pressure than they were historically. And they're also more expensive. The system is a $12 billion system. Next slide. So I've just talked about some of these things. Isn't there higher pressure? And one of the things that concerns me about the way the industry tackles this is that they say well, we're going to meet the same standards. Well, these standards are kind of old and out of date. And they're doing what a lot of industry does. They're taking technology and doing more with less. And a lot of times that's good, to do more with less, to use, you know, use technology and materials more efficiently, more intelligently, and you can save money and save resources. But I don't think what they're doing is taking into account the fact that these pipelines are more dangerous than pipelines in the past, that they're bigger and under higher pressure. So it isn't just a matter of keeping TransCanada at the same level, which we'll argue for various reasons. But I think that actually the pipeline safety needs to be increased and enhanced significantly because the pipelines are simply more dangerous than in the past. And also we'll talk about this more, I'm sure we'll get into questions. There's emergency response planning for this required by the federal government. And those emergency response plans are developed and reviewed only between the industry and the federal government. You know, we tried to bring this up in South Dakota and they refused to let us participate in the process. A federal court case said that this should all be subject to public review, but PHMSA has never agreed with that, and they've never complied at a national level with that court decision. You know, my belief is that pipelines are more safe. Any kind of oil equipment, any kind of facility like this is more safe if more people are involved in looking at the plan and having input into it. And we've seen the disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, you know, would that have been alleviated if there was more public involvement, more independent expert involvement in figuring out what to do and how to handle that situation before it happened? Well, I think that the same thing is true, that Nebraskans should be able to look at the emergency response plan that's developed to protect them and have a chance to comment on it and have an opinion about it. You know, we should know where the emergency responders are located. We should know where the equipment is. We should know what kind of equipment it is. We should know what the training has been for the emergency responders, how long it will take them to get them to different places in the pipeline. You know, all those kinds of details are very, very important for determining whether a response plan will in fact work. You know, and there's just no way around getting into the nuts and bolts of these plans and seeing what they really are. But right now, I'm not sure that hardly anybody in Nebraska, maybe one of our other panelists, has seen the emergency response plan. But anybody here seen the emergency response plan? Anybody even hear about it? You've had no ability to get it, no opportunity to comment on it. And I don't think that's right. I think that citizens should have a right to participate in the efforts that are designed to protect them. Next slide. Also, I put out a report. I don't think we have enough copies for everybody. Actually, I didn't print this one out, but it's online. And I've got a slide coming next on this. But when you look at what's historically been exported from Canada, it's pretty limited in terms of, it's a pretty flat line development growth rate. Over the last 16 years, the numbers are it's increased by about 54,000 barrels per day. Pretty much flat. I mean, you put a straight line through the numbers and it just cuts straight through them. At that rate, it's going to take approximately, I believe, like 26 years to use up the capacity in the Keystone 1 and the Alberta Clipper pipeline. So, you know, I think they planned on this pipeline infrastructure during the boom, and now it's all gone bust. And you know, going forward, there's real questions about whether that volume will be needed and when. And I have another slide about that in a second. Let's see. Also, I want to let you know that a number of major oil companies have opposed the Keystone pipeline, Keystone XL pipeline, and this was in Canada's National Energy Board hearing. It's a national Canadian government agency that permits pipelines in Canada, including Suncor Imperial Oil, which is which is ExxonMobil, Nexen, and British Petroleum. They've all said, don't permit this pipeline, it isn't needed. And you know, they're in a position to know. And there's a variety, sure, they're competitors at some level and they have different interests, but nonetheless, I don't think they argue that if there wasn't really legitimate grounds for saying that this pipeline isn't needed. Usually you don't see industry people arguing in an agency that somebody else's project isn't needed. Also Suncor, one of the biggest producers in Canada, extractors in Canada, argued for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission the Alberta Clipper pipeline should have been built or should have been delayed, and that's already done. And then finally, 3 U.S. refiners, 2 in Kansas and 1 in Oklahoma, have all sued Canada in federal court or in court in Canada, and they're trying to avoid their contracts with TransCanada. They say that the cost overruns, which were on average about 100% cost overruns for the construction of the pipeline, meant that TransCanada shouldn't have gone ahead with construction because it meant the shipping costs are just higher than these refineries planned on. But I think the fact they want to avoid their contracts and not just try to reduce the rate suggests that they would just as soon get rid of the contract altogether. And I think it's because, you know, oil demand in the U.S. is down, refineries are very much underutilized right now, and I think these refiners are looking at having to pay a lot for shipping and a lot for oil that they'd rather not pay. I think there's cheaper ways to get their oil. They think there's cheaper kinds of oil to get. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the slide that shows the development rate in Canada. So you can see it's a pretty straight line, not development. This is the export rate. These are the actual numbers of exports of heavy oil into the United States. Pretty much a straight line. If people are into statistics, you can see that the R squared there is 0.951. It's a very good fit, very close fit. Next slide. And this is the blue part down there at the left-hand side is just what we were looking at. That's the data, historical data. The red line is extrapolating that into the future on a flat line basis because that's what there wasn't really a curve there. And then the first bump, the black line shows the pipeline capacity. That's the export capacity to the U.S. So the first big bump there is the combination of the first Keystone pipeline with the Alberta Clipper. And you can see that right now it's way, way above what current need, current exports to from Canada to the United States are. And even if you try to eyeball that and go over, you're looking at somewhere in the probably that same trend continues somewhere in the 2030s before those pipelines are fully utilized, assuming that even goes on that long and we need that oil anyway. But then if you add the Keystone XL pipeline on top of that, you can see it's far and away more than Canada currently exports. And you're looking at 2056 before all 3 of those pipelines would be fully utilized. So the question becomes, is this pipeline really needed?